My daughter slapped me, my son clapped, and my daughter-in-law smirked like it was all rehearsed. That moment, I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just walked out of the banquet they said was in my honor. For 3 years, I stayed quiet. I hoped they'd remember who I once was to them. But when they brought a contract and tried to erase me with a signature, I remembered something else. A voice, a promise, a document they forgot I had. That night, I unlocked the box my husband left me, and I finally wrote the ending they never saw coming. The envelope was thick, too thick for a birthday card. My name was written in silver script across the front. No mum, no mother, just Margot. I sat at the edge of the kitchen table, the morning light catching on the curve of my teacup. The house was still. The kind of stillness that only lives inside an old woman's home after the people she raised have left it behind. Inside the envelope was a glossy invitation full of floral flourishes and embossed lettering. An evening to honor our matriarch, a celebration of legacy and love. It was signed by Lana, not handwritten, just printed. I held the card in my hand a little longer than I should have. I stared at the words until they blurred. I had not heard Lana's voice in over 3 years, not since the week after my husband's funeral, when she moved my things into the guest room without asking. So now, a party, in my name. I ran my fingers along the edge of the invitation. It was beautiful, deliberately so, the kind of design that costs money. I imagined Lana at a print shop, choosing fonts and paperweight. She always had an eye for aesthetics, and a knack for timing. It was dated for next Saturday, at Reed's new home, the one with the open concept kitchen and the backyard built for catered events. My chest tightened as I set the card down. What do you do when your own children go silent for years and then suddenly reappear in calligraphy? They had not visited, had not asked if I needed anything. When my knee surgery came and went, I called an Uber to the hospital. When the roof leaked last winter, I paid for it with my pension check. Now they wanted to honor me. I stood and walked to the drawer beneath the toaster. It still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Tucked at the very back was a small Polaroid from 20 years ago. I was standing in our old garden, my hands covered in soil, my husband leaning over, brushing dirt from my cheek. He used to say I was the root holding the family tree upright. That picture reminded me. I wasn't always invisible. I looked at the invitation one more time. I could have thrown it away. I could have stayed home and let them carry on their show without me. But I didn't. Because something about that perfect invitation felt wrong, too smooth, too staged. I picked up the phone and called Dolores. She still worked part-time at the florist, where Lana used to place her corporate orders. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Dolores said something that made my stomach drop. They booked the venue 3 months ago, but your name wasn't part of the plan, not until last week. I hung up slowly. So it wasn't about honoring me. It never was. But I would still go, not to be honored, but to see exactly what they were trying to bury me under. And maybe, just maybe, to remind them, I am still Margot, and I am not done yet. I arrived at Reed's house 5 minutes early. The driveway was already full. A valet waved me toward the curb like I was one of the neighbors who wandered in by accident. The house glowed with golden string lights draped across the hedges. Tables were set up in the backyard, each one decorated with soft linen, crystal glassware, and centerpieces of cream-colored roses. My name was nowhere. No sign, no place of honor. One of the younger servers, a boy who looked no older than 16, pointed toward a small table near the sliding door to the kitchen. It was tucked halfway behind a tall potted ficus. The chair wobbled when I sat. There was no name card, no water. From this angle, I could hear the staff moving in and out of the kitchen, clinking trays, whispering. I pulled my shawl tighter. The air was warm, but something about that corner felt cold. Camille was the first one I saw. She floated through the yard with a glass of white wine, laughing at something Lana whispered. Her dress shimmered, gold sequins catching the light with every step. When her eyes finally landed on me, she didn't smile. She just nodded, barely, then looked away, as if my presence was inconvenient, like she had tolerated it, not welcomed it. Lana stood near the front, holding a small stack of note cards. Her makeup was impeccable, her posture sharp. She tapped a spoon gently on a champagne flute and began to speak. We gather tonight to mark the next chapter, not just of our family's legacy, but of how we define purpose, community, and stewardship. She never looked at me. Behind her, Reed adjusted his tie and stepped forward. Tonight isn't only about gratitude, it's about vision, about structure, about the future of what our family has built. I felt it then, not grief, not anger, something stranger, like being the guest at your own retirement party, except no one told you you'd been let go. Camille drifted behind the speakers, close enough to be seen, not close enough to be involved. She sipped her wine slowly, eyes darting between faces. Then Reed smiled and gestured toward a small table near the front. It held a large folder, bound in leather, with gold lettering on the front. A notary stood nearby, holding a clipboard. No one said my name, but I knew. That folder had something to do with me, and they were parading it like a prize. Someone clapped. Lana took a bow, as if she were the host of a successful fundraising gala. Camille raised her glass toward Reed. I stood up. No one noticed. I walked to the edge of the gathering, near enough to hear their final words. Lana glanced at the notary, then said, "We're ready to formalize the transition. The timing couldn't be better." Camille turned just slightly. Her lips curled at the corner. Not quite a smile. Something smaller, quieter, calculated. Then Reed said, "All we need is one more signature." The notary turned toward me. I didn't move. Lana's heels clicked as she walked toward me. She leaned in. Her voice was gentle, too gentle. "This is a formality, just so we can move ahead." And then, as I stood still, she lifted her hand and slapped me. It wasn't hard. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Camille let out a breath. Reed clapped once, slowly like it was punctuation. No one said a word, and I did not cry. Because this wasn't a surprise. It was a reveal, and I had been ready for it. The room fell still after the slap, though music continued playing somewhere far off, as if from another party. I didn't react. My face stung, but not from pain, from clarity. The notary stepped forward, clearing his throat. He was young, maybe Reed's age. He held out a pen. "Mrs. Alden," he said, keeping his eyes low, "the documents are ready for signature. Initial here and here." He didn't look at me like I was his elder. He looked at me like I was the last box on a checklist. I glanced down at the folder. Gold letters read, "Family Estate Reallocation." I opened it. Pages and pages. Typed, indexed, sections highlighted, witness signatures already in place, a final line waiting. My name was printed in bold. In that moment, I realized this hadn't been a spontaneous decision. This had been drafted, reviewed, notarized, all before they ever sent the invitation. They had decided to erase me before they even looked me in the eye. Reed's voice cut in, smooth but firm. This just clarifies the trust structure, Mother. It keeps things clean. It's not personal. I looked up at him. He couldn't hold my gaze for more than a second. Lana crossed her arms. If you want to cause a scene, do it quickly. We have investors here. Camille didn't speak. She didn't need to. She leaned slightly on one hip, arms folded, her fingers running along the edge of a bracelet I'd never seen before. White gold. Probably from the same family fund they were now pushing me out of. I looked back at the page. My thumb rested over the signature line, but I didn't lift the pen. I slid the folder closed. I won't be signing anything tonight, I said. There was a pause. Not gasps, not shouting, just silence. The kind that settles when people are deciding whether to press harder or back away. Lana scoffed. You're being dramatic. That's when she reached out again. I stepped back. And then, from the corner of the garden, Reed clapped once. A single, slow clap. It echoed too loud for such a small gesture. Camille smirked. That tiny curl of the lip I'd seen earlier, now deeper. Satisfied. What stayed with me wasn't the slap. It wasn't even the clap. It was the look in Camille's eyes. She knew this would happen. She had expected it. Maybe even planned for it. And she didn't care if I saw it. I stepped away from the table. The notary looked relieved. He quickly packed his clipboard. Reed didn't stop me. Neither did Lana. Camille raised her glass and whispered something to someone behind her. I didn't wait to hear. As I walked past the guests, none of them met my eyes. Their laughter resumed, like I had simply fulfilled a brief role and was now dismissed. Disposable. I made it to the driveway without a word. My car was still parked at the curb. The valet didn't offer to open the door. Inside the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel. My pulse was steady. I stared ahead at the string lights. I had built this family's first savings account from scratch. I'd packed Reed's lunch every day until he left for college. I'd paid for Lana's first apartment after her divorce. And still, they had tried to write me out. But I wasn't the kind of woman who left empty-handed. At home, I unlocked the hall closet, pulled out the step stool, reached behind the top shelf, past the winter coats. There, wrapped in a linen bag, was the box. Small, heavy, the lock still clicked tight after all these years. I carried it to the kitchen, placed it on the table. My hand hovered over it. I already knew what was inside. The original will. And something even more important. A USB drive. And my husband's voice, waiting. When I stepped out of that banquet hall, the air felt heavier than it should have. The night was warm, but I shivered. No one followed me. No one called after me. I wasn't surprised. I drove home without music, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if that was the only solid thing left. At a red light, I glanced at myself in the rearview mirror. My cheek still carried the red mark from Lana's hand, but that wasn't what stung. It was the applause. It was Reed's casual little clap and Camille's smug silence. I pulled into the driveway, headlights slicing across the closed garage. The house felt colder than usual. As I walked in, my heels echoed against the floor. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared into nothing. Then I reached for the drawer under the staircase. I hadn't opened that drawer in 3 years. Inside was a small wooden box, locked with a brass key I still wore on a chain around my neck. I undid the chain slowly, fingers trembling not from fear, but from something deeper. Restraint, maybe. Or memory. I opened the box. There it was. The envelope with the original copy of Samuel's will, untouched. I pulled it out gently and laid it flat on the table. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink was clear. Every line was familiar. Every word was a reminder of the man who saw me, truly saw me. Then I reached deeper into the box and retrieved the USB drive, the one Samuel had handed me just days before he passed. I remember the way he'd pressed it into my palm, his hand still steady despite the weakness in his voice. He had whispered, not from fear, but intention. If they ever try to erase you, let them hear this. I walked over to the old laptop in the den, one we never upgraded because Samuel said it was reliable. I plugged the USB in, a single audio file. I clicked it open. His voice came through, steady, calm, deliberate. My name is Samuel Everett. This message is for whoever needs to understand what I wanted. My wife, Margot, built everything with me. Every cent, every idea, every sacrifice. I made sure the will reflects that. If anyone changes it, they're not just dishonoring me, they're denying the truth. Don't let them write over the story we lived. I sat frozen. The voice I hadn't heard in years filled the room, but it didn't break me. It braced me. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands weren't trembling anymore. I walked back to the kitchen, poured the water down the sink, and stood there in silence. I wasn't going to fight with them. I wasn't going to scream or plead. I was going to hold my ground. I opened the drawer again and pulled out a small notepad. I wrote down 3 names and numbers. Then I closed the box and relocked it. Before bed, I placed the will and the USB in a new folder and slid it under the floorboard in the back guest room, just in case. That night, I slept. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. Not because the pain was gone, but because I finally remembered who I was. And I knew Samuel never forgot. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet, just as I needed it to be. I made a cup of black tea and sat by the window, letting the early light warm my face. My mind was calm, but my purpose was clear. By 8 o'clock, I was dialing Harold's number. It had been years since I last heard his voice, but when he answered, it was as if time folded in on itself. He didn't ask why I was calling. He just said, "I've been waiting for this, Margot." I told him everything. The party, the contract, the slap, the recording. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked for the documents. I promised to scan them that afternoon and drive to his office the next day. Before hanging up, his voice lowered into something softer. Samuel always knew this might happen. He made sure you'd have what you need when the time came. I sat for a moment, letting that sink in. Later that morning, I made my second call. Dolores answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that familiar, tired warmth. She was once a close friend, before Camille came along and turned every family gathering into a silent contest of status and usefulness. Dolores had worked at the foundation my husband and I built. She was the heart of it, quiet, compassionate, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and showed up with soup when your world fell apart. Until one day she was gone. No notice, no goodbye. I asked her if she remembered why. She chuckled. Not bitter, just worn. Because your daughter-in-law said I didn't bring enough value to the team, that I was dead weight. She said it while wearing a jacket I knew you gave her. Dolores didn't ask why I was calling either. She simply asked when I'd like to meet. We decided on the same afternoon. She offered to bring pastries, and for a moment I smiled. The third and final call was harder, not because I didn't trust the person on the other end, but because she was the last thread connecting me to the days before everything started unraveling. Her name was Evelyn, an old administrative aide at the local credit union. She had worked with Samuel closely, especially during the early years of our family trust. When she answered, she sounded surprised but happy. I told her I needed help checking the activity on a few family accounts. I reminded her I wasn't asking for anything illegal, only that I wanted to know if my children had used my name or Samuel's name for transfers we never approved. She paused. I could almost hear her mind turning. Margot, if something is going on, you deserve to know. Let me do some digging. I'll call you in a few days. I thanked her and hung up. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't care. The past 3 years had taught me that silence often protects the wrong people. I had stayed quiet too long. Now, every conversation felt like reclaiming a part of myself. That afternoon, Dolores came by. She brought warm lemon scones and a printout of the board roster from 5 years ago, when she was forced out. I made tea again, this time for both of us. We sat in the living room and talked about Samuel, about the old days, about the quiet, unnoticed women who always did the work but never signed their names on the front page. When she left, she hugged me longer than necessary. You still have fight in you, Margot. That's more than most people ever get back. By the end of the day, I had 3 allies. One knew the law, one knew the players, one knew where the paper trail began. And I knew I wasn't going to be erased without leaving a mark. I spent the following morning at the kitchen table, every document spread out before me like a broken puzzle. My fingers traced the lines of the will, the signatures, the transfer records. I moved slow, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I began with the trust account. Dolores had flagged a few dates. That helped narrow it down. I pulled the quarterly statements and focused on wire transfers marked as consulting fees. One, in particular, stood out. A payment of $16,000 made to a consulting agency registered just a few weeks before the payment. The agency name? CMC Advisory. I didn't need a lawyer to recognize Camille's initials. I printed the statement and circled it in red. Then I moved to the family foundation expenses. Lana had organized a wellness retreat last spring, something she claimed was to celebrate women in leadership. I remembered receiving a generic email about it. Never a call, never an invitation. The retreat had taken place at a luxury spa in Colorado. I dug deeper. There it was. $37,000 paid to Haven Springs Spa. Cross-checked it with the foundation's ledger, listed under community outreach. Except this retreat wasn't public. It was invite-only, filled with Lana's friends and a few social media influencers. Dolores confirmed it with a forwarded photo album she found online. Lana smiling in a white robe, clinking champagne glasses, a banner in the background that read, "Rooted in Renewal." I pinned the spa expense beneath the consulting transfer. The next folder was Samuel's archive. His handwriting still haunted me. Tidy, intentional. I found a letter tucked inside an old file marked Legacy, handwritten notes about board members, donation lists, estate strategy. One line caught my eye. Record of conflict. Camille raised concern over Dolores's value to the team, urged termination, no performance issue noted. There it was, a paper trail of the beginning. By noon, I had assembled everything. I labeled the folders. Diane Trust, unauthorized payments, foundation, fund misuse, conflict notes, staff removal. I scanned them all into a secure drive Harold set up for me. He told me to hold on to the physical copies and store them off-site. That afternoon, Evelyn from the credit union called back. Her voice was careful, measured. She confirmed that Camille had recently attempted to update trustee contact information, replacing my name with Reed's on 2 accounts. She said the request had been submitted electronically, with a scanned letter supposedly signed by me. She paused. Margot, the signature doesn't match your other forms. I flagged it for now. But you should know, Reed's already acting like it's been approved. I thanked her. I felt my chest tighten, but not from fear, from something sharper. Anger, maybe. Or finally, clarity. I hung up the phone and sat back in the chair. The pieces fit. They were building a story without me in it. They thought I was too slow to keep up, too sentimental to fight back. But I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting to put the truth back where it belonged. By the time the sun dipped past the trees, I had 3 folders, 2 backups, 1 locked briefcase, and a timeline. A week from now, Harold would start sending letters. But first, I had one more step. I needed a witness. So I called Sharon, a notary who had known Samuel since his early days in city council. I asked her to come by. She didn't ask why. She just said she'd bring her stamp and be there before dinner. That evening, as she signed the affidavit, confirming the contents and authenticity of my documents, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, exactly, but steadiness. I wasn't done, but I was no longer uncertain. The morning sun hadn't fully climbed the sky when Harold arrived. He looked older than I remembered, his cane tapping softly on the tile floor as he stepped into my kitchen, like he had 100 times back when my husband was alive. We didn't exchange pleasantries. He simply nodded, opened his briefcase, and began laying out the plan we had quietly agreed on over the phone. 3 letters. That's what he called them. Not legal notices, not demands, just 3 letters. But the weight they carried could knock down stone walls built on lies. The first letter was addressed to Reed. It outlined the potential criminal liability of presenting a forged financial document to a legal institution. Harold had traced the funds Camille funneled through the family trust under the guise of consulting fees. There were receipts. There were dates. Camille's name was on them. Reed's digital signature sat beside it. The second letter went to Lana. It was more surgical. Harold had identified several instances where the family account was used to pay vendors affiliated with her spa events. One name caught my eye: Violet Lux Retreats, a spa in Napa Valley. I remembered the brochure on her coffee table last spring. Harold attached a timeline of withdrawals matched with event dates, proving misuse of family funds. The third letter, though, was the most powerful. It included the original will, still notarized, and a scanned copy of the USB voice file from my husband. Harold stamped it and attached a sworn affidavit. This one didn't go to my children. It was sent to our family bank and to the regional office of the Estate Management Authority. This letter was not a warning. It was a preemptive strike. I didn't deliver the letters myself. That would have made it personal. Harold made a call to someone at the bank, a woman named Maren, who once worked under my husband. She remembered him, still spoke of him with reverence. She agreed to place the sealed letters in the correct hands, without delay, without drama. That afternoon, I sat in my garden while Harold drafted the final supporting documents. The air smelled of rosemary and fresh soil. The stillness was heavy, but not suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I felt as if I wasn't the one scrambling to catch up. I looked over at the small silver box on the patio table, the same one I had unlocked just days ago. Inside were scanned copies, photos, timelines, bank statements. The truth was no longer hidden. It was printed, stapled, notarized, and sealed. Harold paused before leaving. He looked at me, not as a lawyer, but as someone who had watched my family try to erase me. "You're doing this with dignity, Margot," he said. They won't see it coming because they never thought you'd stand. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He already knew. As the sun dipped lower, I lit a single candle on the kitchen counter. It wasn't for drama. It was habit. My husband used to say it gave the room a kind of peace, especially before something important. Tomorrow, the letters would land. Camille's facade would crack. Reed's entitlement would falter. Lana's carefully curated image would show its seams. The first call came from Reed. His voice was clipped, almost too calm to be natural. He spoke in circles, asking if I had seen something or heard from Harold. I stayed quiet. Then he said it. Camille had told him about a letter. Not just one, 3. And now the bank had frozen access to their joint account. He tried to sound angry at me, but I could hear it. He wasn't furious. He was afraid. Before I could say a word, he shifted. Said Camille had always run the finances, that he never looked too closely at what she did. He said her judgment had changed lately. Then, barely a breath later, he mumbled that maybe it was Lana's idea. He didn't know anymore. I didn't respond. I just listened. For the first time in years, I wasn't reaching for anyone's approval. When I hung up, the second call came. Camille. Her tone was laced with ice. She asked if I was really doing this, then accused me of dragging the family name through the mud. She called Harold a relic, accused me of staging a coup. I didn't speak. That silence must have unnerved her. She tried again, softer. Said she could make things right, that she just needed me to reconsider. She asked what I wanted. Still, I said nothing. And then she snapped. If you go forward with this, I'll make sure everyone remembers your past. I'll drag your parents' names into it. Their debts, their shame. I know people who remember. I took a breath. My hands were steady. I remember them too, I said. And I hung up. It wasn't a power play. It was clarity. The third call wasn't a call at all. It was a voicemail from Lana. She didn't even try to deny anything. Instead, she begged. She said her investors had pulled out, that a planned expansion deal for her spa chain had collapsed because the banks flagged inheritance issues. She cried. Then she said something that stayed with me longer than the threats. I never wanted to cut you out. I just thought it would be easier if the story ended your way. There it was, the rewriting of a life, wrapped up in polished language. Easier if the story ended your way. Not a lie, not quite. But not the truth either. That evening I lit another candle, not to comfort myself, but to remember. Years ago, my husband had said, "Never let the silence make you feel erased. Use it." I sat down at the kitchen table and reread the will again, his signature, his notes in the margins, his line in the final paragraph. To my wife, Margot, who held this family quietly together, even when we forgot she was the glue. Forgot. Not ignored. Not dismissed. Forgot. There's a difference. They had forgotten. I had remembered. I didn't call anyone else that night. I didn't have to. The silence did the work now. Reed would turn against Camille. Camille would claw at Lana. Lana would play the victim. But the web had already unraveled. By morning, their stories would fall apart, not because I tore them down, but because I never bought into them to begin with. There are moments when a person reclaims something quietly without shouting. That night, I reclaimed my name. And the next morning, I would show them that remembering is stronger than rewriting. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. in a small conference room at Harold's office. No fancy venues, no photographers, no family banners. Just one long wooden table, worn at the edges, and 4 chairs waiting for 3 grown children and a mother who used to stay silent. I arrived first, wearing the same blue coat I wore to their father's funeral. Not for drama, for memory. Lana came next. She didn't greet me. She looked pale, smaller than usual, like her voice had been stolen by fear. Reed followed, still wearing a suit too crisp for the occasion, with tension in his jaw that didn't belong to a man in control. Camille was last. High heels, flawless makeup, but her eyes darted. She wasn't used to rooms she couldn't dominate. Harold walked in, placed 3 identical folders on the table, and nodded at me. I stood. "This isn't a negotiation," I said. "This is a correction." No one moved. "Your father's will remains unchanged," I continued. "You are all aware now that it was never revised, never reassigned. It stands. As does the evidence that some of you attempted to rewrite it without legal ground." Camille shifted in her seat. Lana lowered her head. I paused and then said what I had held inside too long. "But I'm not keeping it." That got their attention. I watched their eyes, the calculations behind them shifting. "I'm placing it all in a foundation, a trust. Not one built on control or guilt. A scholarship fund, a resource network, for women who, like me, were erased inside their own homes." I opened a small leather folder and slid the first page across the table. "The name of the fund is For Those They Forgot. Your father once told me I was the glue that held everything together, and then you forgot me. But forgetting does not erase. It only delays what must return." Reed exhaled sharply. Camille clenched her jaw. Lana whispered, almost to herself, "Why would you do this?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The papers in front of them spoke louder than anything I could say. They would no longer inherit through assumption. They would no longer speak for me with polished words and altered documents. That era was gone. Harold handed them each a copy of the fund's legal structure. Everything transparent, nothing hidden. The foundation would be launched within the month. The assets that once held our family together would now help others rebuild their lives after being cast aside. Camille tried to speak. Something about legacy, about bloodlines. I held up my hand. "Legacy is what you leave in truth, not what you snatch in secret." I gathered my coat. The room was still. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Deserved. I looked at each of them once more, and then I walked out. That morning, I didn't just reclaim legal ground. I reclaimed meaning. I rewrote the definition of motherhood, not as the woman who gives endlessly, but as the one who protects what matters, even from her own children. And as I stepped into the cold morning light, the only thing I carried was peace. 3 days after the announcement, I received a phone call from the senior account manager at Morgan Financial. Her voice was steady, respectful, but there was a firm edge underneath every word. She informed me that Reed's access to the family fund had been temporarily suspended, pending a formal investigation into irregular authorizations made under his name. The flagged activity included a series of wire transfers, marked as legal retainer fees and early inheritance disbursements, none of which had prior approval. When I asked who had reported the inconsistencies, she paused. "Your friend Walter brought them to our attention." Walter, my husband's closest friend, former business partner, and now a media consultant for a local news syndicate. He had been silent for years, but never unaware. The next morning, a brief segment aired on regional news. Just a few lines. A high-profile family in Charleston facing internal legal dispute over disputed inheritance transfers. No names. But the image behind the anchor was our old family estate, blurred but recognizable to anyone who mattered. Camille was the first to feel it. Her social pages locked, comments disappeared, sponsors started backing out of her skincare line collaboration. By midday, a press release was posted by her PR firm, citing unrelated personal matters. Lana's face appeared in a separate feed. Her spa's investment partners had withdrawn interest, citing unresolved legal risks tied to the source of her startup capital. I knew they had traced the money trail. Funds reallocated from the same dormant trust that had once been meant for education initiatives. All signed off under her authority. All done quietly. But now, no longer invisible. Reed tried to reach me. He called once, then again. Left a message short and sharp. No apology. Just outrage that I had let this become public. That I had weaponized the family name. I didn't return his call. The bank moved swiftly. Camille's former transactions were frozen. A subpoena was filed. And with that, the mask began to slip. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was exposure. And exposure has its own weight. Not loud, not violent, just undeniable. What surprised me most was the silence from Lana. She had always been the loudest. But now, nothing. No email, no knock, just absence. I imagined she was scrambling, rewriting investor decks, spinning a narrative of victimhood. But the investors were no longer interested in stories. They wanted documentation. Back in my own home, I stood by the window and looked out over the garden my husband once planted. A place meant for family gatherings, now grown wild. I didn't mourn it. I let it be. Just like I was learning to let other things be. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clean. That afternoon, I received a letter by courier. Not legal, not personal. Just a request for a statement from a major publication. Walter had quietly leaked that the foundation launch would coincide with a public event honoring donors who stood against generational erasure. They wanted to feature the first profile on the founder. I declined. Let the work speak. Let the headlines fade. The point was never to be seen. It was to be heard, just once, and remembered. And by then, the message was already moving, in the silence between emails, in the loss of sponsorships, in the ripple through the city's financial networks. They thought silence meant surrender. But sometimes, silence is a storm waiting for the right moment to land. It was nearly dusk when I heard the knock. Not rushed, not urgent, just deliberate. I stood in the hallway, not moving. The knock came again, then a pause, then the soft voice. "It's me, Camille." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired, maybe even defeated. But I stayed still. My hand rested on the knob, but I didn't turn it. I had already prepared the note earlier that day, not out of spite, but because I knew this moment would come. I slid the envelope beneath the door. There was a pause. Then I heard the paper lift, the faint rustle as she opened it, and silence. I wrote, "I was once your mother-in-law. I once made soup when you were sick. I once sewed a hem for your favorite dress because you were too busy. I once stood behind you at Reed's graduation and smiled even when you forgot to mention my name in your thank you speech. I once waited for you to remember I was family. But now, I am simply Mrs. Margot Landry, a citizen, a widow, a woman who decided to keep what she built. I will not speak with you. I will not undo what has been done. And I will not open this door." The silence lasted longer this time. I heard no reply, no footsteps, just the long breath of someone who had finally read the truth. Then she left. I watched her walk down the front path from behind the curtain. She didn't look back. Her coat was too light for the weather, her shoulders hunched, not from the cold, but from something heavier. When the gate clicked shut, I turned to find Dolores sitting on the couch, flipping through a folder. She had been with me the whole afternoon, finishing the last bit of paperwork for the foundation. The state had approved our non-profit charter. We had a name, a seal, and a starting list of women to support. For those they forgot. The phrase wasn't mine. It came from my husband, in a letter he once wrote to a friend. He believed the greatest danger in life wasn't hatred. It was indifference. It was forgetting the ones who made the quiet sacrifices. And now, with this foundation, I could make sure we remembered. Dolores handed me the official documents with a small nod. We both knew what this meant. It wasn't just about legacy. It was about rebuilding something honest in a world that tried to bury it. Later that evening, I made a cup of tea and stepped out to the back porch. The wind had calmed. The garden was quiet. The leaves rustled without urgency. And I felt still. Not proud, not angry, just steady. I hadn't won. I hadn't lost. I had chosen. The morning was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, the steam from my tea curling up in slow spirals. Light poured through the window, touching everything with a soft gold that made even the worn edges of the counter feel peaceful. I didn't check the mail. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't open the news. I just sat there, breathing, holding the cup with both hands, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. It had been a long road, not dramatic, not loud, but relentless in its quietness. Across the room, the television played at a low volume. Dolores had left it on. A local news anchor mentioned something about a new community initiative. Then the name appeared, for those they forgot. The screen showed a modest gathering, a few women, a small conference table, some brochures, nothing glamorous. But it was real. Then came a photo, black and white. My husband, his hands resting on a bench, a quote beneath it. "We remember those they tried to erase." I watched in silence, not out of pride, but out of a sense that something had been returned to where it belonged. I had not sought revenge. I had not claimed a title. I had only followed the path my husband left me, trusting that truth, even when quiet, could still be heard. The tea had gone lukewarm. I didn't mind. I stood and opened the back door. The garden greeted me. It had bloomed, gently, in places I hadn't noticed before. Not bold, just enough to say I'm still here. And so was I. They thought I would sign because they called me mother. But being a mother is not the same as giving everything away. Sometimes it means knowing when to stop giving. Sometimes it means choosing yourself. And this time, I did. If you've ever felt forgotten, dismissed, or quietly erased from your own family's story, I want you to know, your worth never depended on their recognition. It was always yours. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story touched something inside you, share it. Let it remind someone else that they are not alone, and it is never too late to reclaim your voice.